introduce Jeffrey in a minute. No, I don't need the mic, do I?
No.
Can you guys hear me all right?
Yeah.
That's helpful. Never very good at juggling technology, whether it's mics or clickers. Manawatia a Matariki. Welcome, everyone. I'm Nick Hannon, Chair of GasNZ. And that was Jeffrey Clark, in case you don't know Jeffrey yet. I'm sure you soon will. Our shining new star of our CE as of, when was it? March, so fairly recently joined us. Every year now, New Zealanders have had the chance to stop as a nation and watch the Matariki constellation rise to mark the new year and to celebrate this with one another. Last year, almost exactly a year ago, of course, GasNZ held our first annual Matariki celebration event. It was a chance for everyone connected to GasNZ to come together to pause, reflect, celebrate, and look to the future. At that occasion, we heard about the state of biogas in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to discuss opportunities and to look to the future with some potential new developments. And it's wonderful to be back here again this year. And I thank you all for joining us this afternoon, even though there may have been a small incentive for later. Looking back at the year that's just passed, in some ways, there's been lots of change. And of course, one of those would be that we've had an election since the last GasNZ Matariki event and a change of government. We've also had, more close to home, of course, Jeffrey joining us, and we welcome him. But in many ways, the real issues, the big issues, seem hardly untouched, or may have even actually worsened to some extent. How should we as a sector adapt what we do to address pressing global climate challenges and pressing domestic energy sector challenges too? How can we ensure that the decisions we make today don't close off the paths we want to take tomorrow? How can we seize the opportunity under the current government to set out a clear, realistic and achievable pathway for gas to 2050 and beyond? And bear in mind that potentially this government won't be here in 3 years' time. As the GasNZ board, we've been thinking about these things too. Today at our board meeting, we've been finalising our refreshed strategy for the coming years, and we're looking forward to sharing that with you at our conference in October. Not an electricity meeting, but I've got a plug in. Oh. That's bad. Our focus remains squarely on what we as gas sector leaders can do to achieve our vision of a sustainable net zero emissions New Zealand, where Kiwis can enjoy gas as a reliable, affordable and renewable energy. One part of achieving that vision is to ensure that the big levers, the policies and legal frameworks we put in place that drive and shape our collective New Zealand behaviours are well designed and robust as possible. That's why today I'm very happy to start our evening off by introducing Dr. Eric Crampton as our provocative guest speaker. I've already set you up there, Eric. Who Eric will be known to many of you as the chief economist of the New Zealand Initiative, as a columnist, a blogger and a public speaker. Eric always brings a lens of clarity and insight, along with a dose of wit and humour, to important New Zealand policy issues. These range from earthquake preparedness to freshwater management, from transport to trade policy, and from food waste to today's topic, emissions trading. And he'll talk about this with us this evening. Specifically, he's going to share his thoughts on how we can take our current emissions trading and carbon reduction framework and turn it into a better bulletproof system, as he terms it. Hopefully, this will trigger some interesting thoughts and questions for us all to discuss and debate. After Eric's presentation and discussion, we invite you all to stay for refreshments, catch up, mix and mingle, and enjoy each other's company. Thanks very much. Over to you, Eric.
And I guess I have to use the mic for the online stuff.
You do.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be in front of the class today. So I say that slightly deliberately. The brief that I got from Jeffrey was a bit of a difficult one. Some of you in the room will know the ETS better than I do. Some of you in the room know that you face a carbon price and that you have to surrender ETS credits and that costs you money, but you don't know much of the background behind that and all ranges in between. And I was reminded of a couple of years ago, I maintained an adjunct affiliation with the University of Canterbury, and I had given a talk there for their MBA program. We were doing some applications around carbon and ETS stuff. So I'd had like 2 days with them to explain the ETS and climate economics and environmental economics. So we'll do a little short course today, and we'll do it the same way that we did with my MBA class, because the same thing with the MBA students, some of them know a hell of a lot more than you do because they've been out in industry forever, and I'm just some guy who sits at a desk in Wellington, right? And others have zero economics background because they're coming into an MBA. Maybe they did principles level ages ago. So our short course outline tonight, and we'll do it again the same as with the MBA class. At any point, stop me and say, Crampton, you got that wrong. Or Crampton, you did not explain that properly. You used some jargon that I've never heard before. What the hell is wrong with you? Or, sorry, Crampton, we all know this already. Speed the hell up. I am happy to take any or all of those as well as questions for clarification. It's much better to just do that as we go than try and hold everything up till the end. And especially if I'm getting something wrong, right? So I can fix it. All right. So we're going to start off with ETS 104, our principles level, where we're just going to be talking about different approaches in general to trying to reduce emissions. Is this working? Okay, here we are. Trying to reduce emissions in general. So we have two basic choices. You can try to use prices, add a price to something, people optimize, or use regulation where you tell people what to do and hope that you get the regulation right. We move from there, ETS 230. Basic structure of our ETS. Maybe a little bit of the history, but probably not. Don't need to get too much into it. More about how it works now. 321, the more advanced level. The main objections that you usually get to the ETS, or that people will always throw at me when I say, why don't we just use the ETS? We don't need all this other stuff. And they say, oh, Crampton, you idiot. Don't you know that there are these problems and flaws with the ETS? Therefore, my crazy regulatory scheme is actually a good idea. Okay, there are versions of that that are not insane. And because there are versions of that that are not insane, we have to then move up to ETS 453, where we try to fix those problems where they occur, rather than bolt a billion different little bits of regulation onto the thing. Economists like what we call keyhole solutions. You try like keyhole surgery, do the least possible damage, go in, fix the thing that's actually broken, rather than bolt a whole pile of other things on top that don't address the underlying issue. Because otherwise it's just a hiding to nowhere. You're going to just keep bolting on forever. So that is our basic course outline. Are we following? Well, everyone's following along. No problem so far. All right. So the things we are going to be doing today are taking as a given the desirability of the Zero Carbon Act's goal of hitting net zero by 2050. I actually think it's desirable, but people can argue about cost effectiveness and all this other stuff. Doesn't matter. Arguments for another day. I'm an economist. I'm not a climate scientist. I take what they tell me and I say, well, you guys are the experts consensus. I'll listen to you. We get the expert consensus from the economists on how to deal with it. Maybe they should listen to us. Two basic ways of getting there. One of them winds up being an awful lot more difficult than the other if you have a pervasive problem, something where there's very broad consumption. You have no clue how much value different people get out of the different things that they are doing that cause emissions. The climate doesn't care where those emissions are coming from. It only cares that there is one more ton of carbon dioxide equivalent going up into the atmosphere. It doesn't care what's from a tailpipe or from my gas hot water at home, anything else. It only cares about net emissions. Prices are a better way of solving the problem in general if you can do it that way for a problem like climate change. Other things are better dealt with through regulation. You probably wouldn't want to just set, well, here's the price for driving 100 kilometers an hour, here's the price for driving 200 kilometers an hour, here's the price for driving 250 kilometers an hour. That might not work out so well. Regulation through speed control make more sense there. Prices work a little better in our case. And we can take an application from that outside of the ETS and outside of carbon and look back to something a little bit earlier that proved the case. So when I was a kid in Canada, we like to get mad at the US. One of the reasons that we got mad at the US, like you guys get mad at Australia, one of the reasons that we got mad at the US is that all of these coal-fired power plants across the US, smoke would blow north. That smoke had sulfur dioxide in it. That would get into the clouds. That would cause acid rain, and it was killing the boreal forest in northern Canada. We get mad at the US about that, and America got mad about it as well. They wanted to get rid of acid rain. It was a real problem. You've got two ways of doing it. You can either mandate that every coal-fired plant puts in a particular kind of tech or capture or scrubbers, whatever you want. Come up with a regulatory solution, say you must do this. Maybe you can try and fine-grain it, saying, well, we'll put a tighter regulation here or a looser one there, or maybe it'll vary by the exact kit that you'd had. You'll probably screw that up. The other option, which is what they took, cap and trade. So here is the amount of sulfur dioxide that we're going to allow to be emitted. We're going to split up the allocations across plants. You can trade them. We've got a declining cap. Adjust, because the prices are going to change as the amount available goes down. Later work on it showed that they were able to solve acid rain for hundreds of millions of dollars per year less than they would have done under the regulatory approaches on the best estimates that they had about it. Okay, because like if you think about monetary policy, they talk about monetary policy getting in all the cracks with interest rates, that you don't have government stimulating the economy, trying to pick the areas to do things. People just respond to the interest rate, it all sorts itself out. Similarly with carbon prices or sulfur dioxide prices, it gets into all the cracks. We have no clue, as some jerk at a desk in Wellington, which tech is going to be best in which places, the trade-offs that they're facing, how close their plants are to being end of life anyway. We've got no clue about any of that, but all of it is going to matter for the people who are at the coalface making the decisions. It's invisible to the person in Wellington. And even if they try really, really hard, and they often try really, really hard, they're going to miss stuff. It's impossible to get it right. And even if you get it right at one point in time, tech changes, economic condition changes. Everything changes all the time. Whatever static solution you come to that you lock in through regulation will not be robust as the world changes around you. If instead you rely on prices, people are adapting to that all the time, like they do to the price of anything else that they are dealing with as an industry, right? You guys are having to adjust all the time. And it just worked. And there's the amount, $200 to $500 million per year on the best estimates that they came to on that. There were some problems that came up with it, ones that wouldn't be experienced in the ETS. They found some difficulties where a lot of the permits wound up being used in poorer parts of the southern US, and you had concentrated SO2 or sulfur dioxide emissions in those places, and it made some people sick. That's not good. CO2 doesn't have the same issue. And to the extent that it's bad, you would want to deal with that through a different regulatory mechanism that keep the cap and trade in sulfur dioxide, add in other bits on regional concentration. Doesn't come up on CO2 because that's a global issue, has no local point source issues. Acid rain proved the case on this stuff. I think it was the first big good one. Of course, we've had similar things with quota management in fisheries. We get this principle right. And really, you can see the difference when you start thinking about the difference in cost of abating the next ton of emissions. You will probably have seen marginal abatement cost curves before. Am I using jargon, or this is all well familiar to you and I'm telling you stuff you already know? Yeah, okay. Well, this was from a slightly older piece now, 2018, just showing orders of magnitude in differences across different types of regulation trying to reduce emissions. Now, ideally, if you're under a price system, people are automatically doing the ones that are negative cost, because like, why would you throw money away? And do things up to the price, carbon price, and then you stop doing things that are more expensive. Now, in a perfect world in which the person at the desk in Wellington can perfectly predict all of these costs and keep updating them over time and get them all right, then maybe you just might be able to get the regulation right, but you'll be really lucky if instead you set a carbon price everyone it finds its own level, right? Gets into all the cracks. And you avoid spending $250 per ton, which is what cash for clunkers cost in the US. And like we've had weird things here on old cars as well. And there are other options that cost order of magnitude less. Like that really matters when you've got a big problem that's going to cost a lot to deal with. If you do it through mechanisms that are 10 times as expensive as they need to be, it's, well, you're going to fail. There we are. So we like prices. Now, how do you do prices? We're still at the 104 level. We have decided that we've got the Zero Carbon Act. We have to get carbon emissions down. You've got a choice between using a carbon tax and using an emissions trading scheme. This stuff was sorted out by Marty Weitzman decades ago. Effectively, it means that we would have wanted to have had a carbon tax. Unfortunately, we've got an ETS instead. It's all fine. The differences aren't going to be that big. So if you get through them, okay, you probably don't want to read the article because it gets it really, really mathy really fast because it's Marty Weitzman and he's like way smarter than me anyways. Maybe you guys can follow the math. But if you get underneath the math, what it's basically worried about is cases where, imagine that you're doing a tax regime on the pollutant and you're just some jerkin at a desk in Wellington, right? That's me. And I'm getting the price and I put it on and I underestimated how much people were going to respond, or I overestimated how much people were going to respond. So imagine that we're talking about nitrate pollution in the Canterbury Plains. And I put a nitrate tax on and I get the number wrong and people emit a lot more nitrogen than I thought and the river dies and we get excess concentration in the aquifer and that's hard to reverse and it's really, really expensive. So the costs of error, if those go up really fast, if you got it wrong, a price is probably not a good instrument. You want to use a quantity in that case. For carbon dioxide, it doesn't matter. You don't have that nonlinear curve for emissions put out by New Zealand because we're small relative to the world. If our emissions were higher than we expected at a given price, it wouldn't be that big a deal in the global sense. Like there'd be extra cost, but it's not like the extra per unit cost starts going up astronomically. So that's a case for using a carbon tax rather than a cap and trade system. For historic reasons, we have a cap and trade system. It's the losses from having the wrong one are not going to be large compared to the transition cost of trying to flip. And there are other beneficial aspects to having a cap and trade system, particularly around sequestration, where you have a net emissions target. So at least in theory, good case for carbon tax. We don't have one. We've got an ETS, but it's all fine. Any questions from 104, or that was all boring stuff? Crampton already knew this. We're all good. We're all on the same page. We're ready for the quiz at the end. The exam. Grades awarded. Chocolate fish. 230. All right. The ETS as it is now is pretty decent. For a long time, it wasn't quite decent. It's pretty good now. So initially, it was solving a bit of a different problem. So lots of countries were adopting hot air credits. New Zealand sensibly was worried about trade leakage, that if you have a big high carbon price here and nobody else does, we lose all kinds of trading opportunities. We kill ourselves for no real climate benefit. So we had an ETS that recognized BS credits from abroad. And that is one way of actually, when the rest of the world decided to stop using those BS credits, then we could also stop using them. And that's a way of saying that we're also going to be following the rest of the world. So there was a crazy genius to it, but it's not a good system. It was a good system relative to a crappy global political economy. Okay, but that's been improving. Then for a while, it wasn't actually a carbon cap and trade system. It was effectively a carbon tax of $20, unless you had the 2-for-1 offer, right? So it was a cap and trade system without a cap. You could buy however many units you wanted at $20. So it was effectively a $20 carbon tax in the covered sector. Almost everything is covered. It is the most comprehensive across categories of emissions internationally. Just we are in the unfortunate position of that a whole pile of our emissions are from biogenic methane in agriculture. Oops, but within the covered sector, it's great. We still need to figure out ag, and I'm going to restrict discussion here to the covered sector and the ETS that applies to that. Ag is its own separate problem. We can maybe talk about it later if we wanted to.
PhD though.
Yeah, we can get there. The Net Zero Act, Zero Carbon Act, has a net target. We want to get net emissions down to zero. Sequestrations are fine. And it was built beautifully. It is meant to recognize durable sequestration, however the heck it happens. For technical reasons, so far, they've only got forestry really recognized. There is no in principle reason that you could not also recognize carbon capture and storage. There's been some progress towards that. So long as it is proven and durable, and that they're not worried that it's just going to leak out, and that you're monitoring that it's not going to leak out, so the accounting is right, then it's fine. There are all kinds of other sequestration that will be coming through as tech evolves, right? And it's then agnostic between removals and reductions. Because the climate doesn't care whether the next ton that's not in the atmosphere is not in the atmosphere because somebody didn't put it out a tailpipe or because somebody sucked it up and put it into a tree, so long as it stays in the tree. And we have a reasonable setup around that. There's a funny bit just on like what Wellington people don't know. I hope not too insulting. The chief scientist for the Ministry of Transport, as he was resigning in disgust at this terrible national government, had spouted off in the press about how awful it is that we have an ETS that recognizes sequestrations rather than just banning people from using cars. Okay, I'm being a little too harsh. I wasn't saying that, but said, well, what even happens if a forest burns down? Well, like the first thing that you find on a Google search is, well, you have to surrender all of the credits that the forest sucked up, right? Now there could be issues yet if the company that has to surrender them goes bankrupt, and you would probably want to sort that out, but that's a common problem across lots of different regulations. But it is something that could be worth sorting out when you get to the bulletproofing. Other durable sequestration, in principle, allowed. Now, I said before that we had an ETS cap and trade system that did not have a cap. We now have an ETS that has a cap, but what the cap actually is, people don't quite fully understand. The cap isn't the amount of units that the government will issue or allocate this year, because credits are durable. If you have a credit, you can surrender it whenever. The actual cap between now and forever is the number of units that are still held, that are outstanding, that were unbacked. I'd earlier talked about sequestration through trees. Those generate backed units. If I sequester a ton into a tree, that generates a credit. That credit I can sell to somebody else. That's a backed unit. That's generated by an activity that's sequestered carbon. The government issues unbacked units. The sum total of the ones that are outstanding and the ones that it's going to issue or allocate this year, plus all of the ones that it's going to issue or allocate between in the years to 2050, that is the underlying cap. And total net emissions from now until forever, so long as the ETS holds, are that cap. And officials really freak out about this one, but we'll get to that. You'll have heard lots of press reports about the carbon market having failed at auction. That is not a failure of the carbon market. It is just that nobody is willing to pay $60 or whatever the confidential reserve price is for carbon that you can sequester in a tree for $30. Right? If you can keep sequestering in trees, why would you spend more to buy credits that the government is generating? So that keeps happening so long as the floor price is above the price of growing trees, and there's some option value that you need to think about when you're doing that. Credits that are not auctioned off in this round will wind up being auctioned in the next round. They accumulate to the end of the year, and then they're wiped at the end of the year. So the effective cap goes down between now and 2050 because those credits don't get issued, right? So the cap gets tighter to the extent that we're not auctioning these units. People paint this as a failure of the act. I think that it's like a failure of the market. It means that we're getting to net zero faster, right? There's that many fewer tons that people are going to be able to emit on net between now and 2050. We can get into whether it makes sense to have a floor, but given the price floor, that's how it works. And unfortunately, we got this here, so we can't quite see this, and that's why. Sorry. The other price intervention that we've had is the CCR units. So government has worried about stockpiled units. They want people to use those up first rather than using ones from auction. So they when setting the carbon budget, they hold a little bit back. They don't release those unless the price gets high enough, and then those get released into market. They are within the carbon budget for the year that's set in those 5-year plans. It's all fine. And then after they've run out of those, well, the price just keeps going up. Overall, then, it remains agnostic between removals and reductions. That's awesome. That's how it should be. Climate doesn't care one way or the other. We discover what the next cheapest way is for keeping the next ton of carbon out of the atmosphere. This is what's going on currently, that nobody wants to pay the confidential floor price, and that's why forestry is effectively setting a price limit. And where previously ETS auction revenues went to outfits like ECA to provide subsidies to people to stop doing things that prices are already telling them to not do, now it's going into the consolidated fund and causing grave problems to the government that is expecting to be able to use those to back other kinds of tax cuts and spending. Oops. But it's better than the other way. All right, we are through ETS 230. I zipped through those because people seem to be, yeah, we know this. Just okay. But if was there any reason that I should go back over any of that?
Eric, can you just
Please
explain the difference between backed and unbacked?
Sure, I will do that one more time. The government auctions or allocates units every year, right? So sells some at auction and gives industrial allocations to firms that are trade exposed, that are carbon intensive, where they worry a lot about carbon leakage. Those units are not backed. Every one of those units that is used represents 1 ton of net emissions from New Zealand. If I grow a tree and they look at it and say, yep, that's a tree, and they give me 1 NZU for having grown that set of trees, that is a backed unit. That unit is backed by carbon that has been sucked out of the atmosphere at some point. And then if I sell it to somebody else and they release carbon, that unit is backed. It doesn't represent a net overall increase in carbon in the atmosphere. Relative to a world where I would have just grown the trees for fun, it'd be an increase in emissions, but I was growing the trees to be able to get the credits that I could sell. Those are net zero. So those are backed units, and that'll matter later when I talk about one of the ways for bulletproofing things, because the difference between backed and unbacked units is going to matter. Weaknesses. You may have noticed that I often spout off about the futility of regulations under the ETS, about the desirability of a price-led approach, that regulations really actually can't work if you've got a properly functioning ETS. And they can't work in a very specific way. Suppose that everything that I put up in 230, that all worked properly, and the cap were set as the cap. If I go in and set a fuel economy standard that reduces transport emissions, or set a ban on new gas connections, or whatever else, the sector that faces the regulation will be buying fewer NZU at auction, or on the secondary market, or getting fewer through industrial allocations. That slightly reduces the price of credits. Those credits get bought then by somebody else who otherwise would have not been emitting, right? Because they were priced out of the market before. All of a sudden, the credits are a little bit cheaper. I can buy these ones now. They're on special. I'll use them. It's awesome. The quantity is what binds. It isn't nothing else. The regulation comes in. It shifts which sectors emit, but it doesn't change the quantum of net emissions until you get into some of the problems we're going to get into here. That's not a case for having no other regulation. The regulations I was talking about that are not going to be effective compared to a bulletproof ETS, those are ones that are trying to reduce emissions directly within the covered sector. Nothing that I'm saying here applies to farm emissions. Those can be targeted by regulations. It'll reduce emissions because they're not priced. Complementary regulations can come up and really have to come up because as carbon prices rise, all kinds of things change. All of a sudden, we've got forests going up all over the place. And problems that we've always had in forestry around slash and things like that and wrecking roads with big trucks, those get worse. The case for regulation around slash or proper forest maintenance, those, you start discovering new problems as economic activity changes. Those problems are not a problem of the ETS. They're not a problem with the carbon price. They are a problem of whatever the activity is. So they need to be handled through their own targeted regulatory regime. Because otherwise, if you keep trying to do it through the ETS, we'll get into the problems you get into that way. So what I'm putting up in the bulletproof case, there's still a case for regulation. It's just a different set of things that you'd be trying to regulate. Now, the Crampton, you're an idiot argument runs as follows. And there are versions of it that I don't think are sound. I'm going to try and give the best steelman version of it. So if I had to argue against me, and I wanted to destroy me, the argument I made. All right, Crampton, you fool. You talked about this cap. Almost all of that cap is units that haven't been released yet. And almost all of those, nobody's written a number down on it. We've got numbers going out over the next small number of years, but after 2030, who knows how many they're going to release. If they decide that they don't want to keep following the path to net zero or take a much slower route, that cap changes. And everything that you were talking about earlier about how regulations aren't going to work, that's just stupid because people respond to these prices. They get angry about rising carbon prices. Did you see them when there was a war in Ukraine and petrol prices went up? Everybody freaked out and then the government freaked out. Politics responds to this kind of stuff and they'll wind up breaking the ETS if you let carbon prices go too high. Letting the ETS work as you get towards net zero, carbon prices are going to get pretty high. And then all of this breaks. And worse, if everyone expects that all of it breaks and that the government will issue more credits and try and effectively do a price targeting regime, regulation actually can reduce emissions. So if there's a sensitivity of the number of units that will be released through the cap in future years, not only can we not just rely, we can't rely solely on the ETS because firms will not be making really expensive investments in things that only make sense if carbon prices increase, if nobody thinks the government will let the carbon price increase. So that is the case against me that I would make. And I don't think it's stupid. There are stupid cases and I don't want to get into those. We'll deal with the serious one. So that's a real potential problem. So I've kind of gone through this. This is, yeah. That's a real problem. It's not a problem of the ETS. It's, even if the ETS were working perfectly, you'd have to deal with other issues as they arise as best you can. This is a real problem. Now, when we were at $80 a ton, nobody's freaking out about it. Because actually petrol prices aren't that sensitive to it because transport really isn't the lowest cost way of reducing emissions. And then people freak out about VKTs. $80 a ton seemed fine, but there could be higher prices that wouldn't. And if that links into future unit supply, we get into problems. And actually another problem that we do have is the bureaucracy really doesn't trust the ETS. Some of it is that they don't trust that it's going to be politically durable, that they think the government will renege, that they won't let prices rise, and that the thing will break, and so people will not be making investments that they should be making. That part isn't crazy. Other kinds of worries about the ETS are just worries about trusting in markets in general. And often it seems that officials don't quite understand how the cap and trade system works or trust prices or markets in general. They very much trust the regulations that they can set and monitor themselves. So those kind of feed into each other. There is a real problem, but there's also the officials' problem.
Eric,
Yes, sir.
first item.
Yes.
Should we think about, say, take, for example, forestry. If you say, you mentioned some number for forestry, creating carbons at half the price or whatever it is. If the slash problem or the roaring problem is not costed in properly, the rest of the country's cross-subsidizing that carbon cost, isn't it?
What you want to do is make sure you're pricing all of those roads properly and that you're enforcing the regs on slash and whatnot. Because if you're having problems in enforcing proper forestry management, it's not just going to be on carbon forestry, it's also going to be on production forestry.
So you're doing regulatory adjustments there to reflect the correct cost.
That's right. So some other market failure is discovered as people change their behavior in response to these prices, and there will be big behavioral changes as prices go up. You find the areas where something isn't right, fix the regulation in the part that is actually broken, rather than there have been pushes saying, well, let's limit the number of forestry credits that are allowed because there's too strong of an incentive to plant forests, or ban it on particular land use categories, all those sorts of things. On different land use categories, that might be a potential solution. It's better than trying to muck around with ETS. But trying to deprecate forestry credits in the ETS, or some suggestions that there have been, like making them time limited, that's not an appropriate way of trying to deal with the problem.
Eric,
Yes, sir.
if the officials don't really get it, how does that affect their advice to the politicians?
Badly.
Yeah. I mean, if prices are, go back to 80 or 100 or 150, a politician could look at that and say, well, I'm going to lose votes. I can't deal with that.
We will get to some of that when we get to the bulletproof.
Okay.
But that is the real potential critique. It's not stupid to worry about that. Yes, sir.
Discounting forestry units value is not appropriate, but it's another, somebody could argue, if you get it right, it's another way of recognizing the other socialized costs of forestry units, right?
Well, you could try doing that, but think about what happens, like right now it's forestry, but we are going to be having thousands of different ways that we are all adjusting to rising carbon prices. And a lot of those are going to generate other problems that we can't even imagine yet. If we try to deal with every one of those as it emerges by putting a new tweak into the ETS, all of a sudden the ETS is going to fall apart. If we target the regulation right at the problem that's being caused rather than trying to do it through the ETS, well, you solve that problem and you can move on to the next one. It's fine. There's also something that economists call the Tinbergen rule. So it was developed in a macroeconomics context, but it applies here as well. The upshot of it is, I think Tinbergen got the Nobel on this stuff. The upshot of it without the math is if you have one problem, you have one instrument to deal with it. If you have two problems and you try to deal with it through one instrument, you're going to screw both up. Okay? So if you've got two problems, you need two solutions. You need at least as many policy instruments as you have problems that you're trying to solve. If you try and solve them all through one thing, it's going to be messed up. You're going to do a bad job of it.
So, Eric,
yes, sir.
That would be like a waterbed effect of, in terms of you solve one issue over here, but another one pops up somewhere else. We've mentioned forestry, but the electricity market, if you stimulate a whole lot of renewables investment, intermittency, then you're creating a whole bunch of issues in that particular market, which will require its own solutions, batteries or regulation or all sorts of.
Waterbed effect is usually used in a slightly different context in this discussion. So if I'm targeting a regulation at the transport sector, trying to say you can't have cars that have terrible fuel economy, well, that frees up carbon credits for somebody else to use. It's like sitting on the waterbed here, you get more emissions over there. In this regulatory space, if you keep trying to layer stuff into the ETS to deal with problems that are emerging that have nothing to do with carbon, you're breaking the response. You're hurting the ETS's ability to target carbon. And there's only one thing in government that really targets carbon dioxide emissions, right? Greenhouse gas emissions. That's the ETS. Like there's other regulations that they try, but it doesn't work well. There are so many parts of government that are specialized in dealing with problems in their sector, right? So like forestry, well, we go to the right agency for that. They know how to deal with forestry. You don't ask the people who are running the ETS to deal with the forestry problem. You give it to the forestry people. You don't ask them to the ETS people to deal with the roading problem. You give that over to NZTA, right? Specialized agencies in their roles are going to get that thing right rather than trying to get the Climate Commission and the ETS to do it. And this does seem a problem. They're desperate to layer on these additional regulations. In part, it's because of expectations that the thing will break, so they don't think that the thing will stick. So we get pushes for all of these kinds of regulations. This one has been particularly frustrating. When the Labour government was pursuing its urban growth agenda, they were banning councils from doing all kinds of things that would stop urban growth, because they caught on to a lot of council tricks and said, no, you can't do that anymore. No, you can't do that anymore. You must allow a lot more building. And then they told council, oh, but you must consider carbon in your zoning and consenting. Well, all of a sudden they got a new tool for banning new subdivisions that they didn't like anyway, right? So, oops. All of those, the most defensible case for them is if the ETS isn't bulletproof. If you think the thing will actually fall over in the 2030s, 2040s, because carbon prices get too high, maybe in the 2060s, then you can start justifying these regulations and it's not indefensible. The other problem that they see, that they think is a problem, but isn't really one, is these unredeemed units. It gets to part of the bulletproofing afterwards. So the stockpiled units terrify officials. They have no clue when an NZU might get redeemed. If you care about the climate, you prefer that the NZU that I've got, that it gets surrendered in 2070 or 2080 or something, like way later, because they're long-lived gases. The longer they're up there, the worse. The more time they spend as an unredeemed ETS credit, the better for the world. Unfortunately, the Zero Carbon Act set these 5-year carbon budgets, and we have to meet the budgets, right? Because the officials, they get handed these budgets and they say, oh, well, we got to make sure that we meet these budgets. Unredeemed credits are a risk because they imagine worlds in which everybody redeems all of their units on like the last day of the emissions budget, and then all of a sudden their budget blows out. And they look, well, we broke our budget. We had to meet this budget. It's a completely artificial line, each one of these. They freak out about it. And the problem isn't the ETS. The problem is the Zero Carbon Act. The Zero Carbon Act sets the carbon budgets. People treat them as though the windows have to be met no matter what. It's a weakness because it induces then a lot of the regulatory activity that is aimed at trying to have emissions fall on one side or the other side of an arbitrary carbon budget line.
It'd not be some kind of problem if, say, they weren't all, say a whole bunch of them were redeemed in the 5 years before 2050. There's a huge spike in emissions. Or is that just an unrealistic?
If the carbon budget is actually fixed and the number of units doesn't change, it's not a problem. They get emitted, but we know that net emissions are going to be the sum total of all of the unredeemed units, plus the ones that are yet to be created. And if they all get redeemed in 2049, okay, fine, net emissions haven't changed between now and forever. And the actual cap is the number of units issued through 2050. They'll get redeemed sometime. Net emissions don't change.
If you redeem them on the last day of 2029, it must have meant that you didn't emit.
That's right.
That point.
That's right.
So emissions don't change.
Exactly. But officials would freak out because it would blow out that carbon budget.
They won't, yeah. No one pats them on the back for all the other emissions budgets that they
undershot. Yeah.
They undershot.
So I would much sooner try to fix the potential real problem in the ETS than pursue 10,000 regulations, all aimed at trying to make industries do what they would be doing in a world in which the ETS were perfect, right? So all of the regulatory interventions are trying to mimic the market. They're trying to guess what industries would be doing if they had certainty that carbon prices would just keep going up and the ETS were durable, binding cap. Okay, they don't trust it, so let's try and set the regulations to force companies to do what they would be doing under a pricing regime. That's really hard to do, right? It's getting almost into like Soviet 5-year plan kind of territory in terms of impossibilities. Like we know that that approach isn't going to be successful. It's necessarily going to be more costly than just relying on the ETS if we can make the ETS bulletproof. So man, there's gains to making the ETS bulletproof because again, there are orders of magnitude differences in cost of abatement across different sectors. So, were I grand poobah for the day and get to bulletproof the ETS? Step one, amend the Zero Carbon Act. So all of the carbon budgets, what I put as being the actual cap, which is the actual cap, just legislate the number. Legislate the number, say, give the number of units that the government will actually issue or allocate between now and 2050. Fix it. And you can make that durable. Like, you guys have seen the movie The Producers, right? Where the shysters, they went around and they were selling more than 100% of the profits from the play. And that's fraud, right? So they went to jail. If you put on each NZU certificate, this is number one of a limited series of however many billion, I don't know, pick a number. This is number one of that limited edition. And you know what? If we sell more than that of unbacked units, you can sue us for securities fraud. Same way as like if a company started issuing more shares than it could, right? It's defrauding its existing shareholders. Set that in the legislation. It then becomes more binding because if a future government chooses to overissue and break the cap, they face financial penalties because everybody's going to sue them for having committed securities fraud, basically, right? So that makes it more durable. Every year's auction and allocation would draw from that fixed number. Yes?
Couple of issues.
Yes.
Are our international contracts to be carbon neutral year on year in 2050 or to restrict the number of units and number of emissions between now and 2050?
I think all of that is deliberately very vague. So it's not even clear if the Paris 2030 stuff binds, right? So if you look at the Treasury accounts in the fiscal risks, they note potential obligations at 2030. They have no clue whether the government's going to follow through on them. So they don't cost them because it's a policy choice still, right?
And binding sovereign governments is quite difficult.
But what could be binding is you've sold me something promising that you're not going to sell more than this number of units. And now you've sold more than that number of units.
Yeah.
Right?
But again, a sovereign, through legislation, they can pretty much do anything, can't they?
Sure. So the government could go and legislate around that. That would be in the same way that the government could go and say every house in the country has now been nationalized.
Yeah.
Right? Like Parliament can do that. Parliament is sovereign. The only thing that you can do is increase the cost of doing things. So here they would have a claim against the Crown that they can sue for. The Supreme Court tends not to like anything that Parliament does and rules against them anyways. But here that could actually be helpful and say, well, no, there was a claim here. That'd be step one, to try and make it more durable. Yes?
Eric, what's the consequence of not meeting a 5-year budget?
There is no real consequence of not meeting a 5-year budget other than that the officials freak out about it.
Yeah, I guess that goes to kind of why abolish them. If it's just for a monitoring purpose to check that we're on kind of track.
You can maintain monitoring without setting it as a budget, because once you put it as a budget, the officials freak out about the unbacked unit or about the stockpile of units. It gives them something that they think that they need to be targeting, even though it doesn't really matter.
Environmental consequence.
I mean, maybe you just change the name from a budget to a glide path.
Well, the environmental consequence of holding units and not redeeming them until a later period is really positive, right? And that's the source of the risk that the officials worry about.
Of not meeting budgets.
So If you have legislated the number of units, net emissions will not change. The timing of them will change, who redeems them will change, but the number does not change. One carbon budget being blown out means another one will have been undershot. So it's difficult for, at least for me, to see the problem of it being future years that have more emissions and current years having far fewer, because it's strictly better to have them later. It accumulates, right?
You are asking a government to set up regulation, to somebody to sue itself, to be open to that kind. That's a big ask. Right?
Well, sometimes governments do want to bind themselves, and it looks like some of what they might be trying to do around oil and gas exploration again is giving rights to sue if those get blocked, right? There's a whole field of constitutional political economy that gets into the ways that governments might want to bind themselves against doing stuff. Now, the advantage of the government making this durable is that they don't have to do the rest of the regulations. The binding of the Crown offers other opportunities to the Crown because they then don't have to worry about a pile of things that they shouldn't have to worry about because they'll be able to just get the job done a lot better.
Eric,
Yes, sir.
it only works that way, it has to work that way to be a proper cap and trade. So
That's right.
you got to get, so it doesn't, the timing doesn't matter within the capped time frame. So you got a budget to 2050, which is the net zero target. You can change that, you can make that shorter, further, whatever, but it's the cap within that makes it work. So I get that. The other bit alongside it, maybe you're going to come to this, which I think is really important for our economy as an export economy, is how the EIT works within that, right? And how you facilitate the retention of industry within that cap.
Yep. Yes. So we're getting into my step 2. Okay. The one real economic risk that we face is that prices here exceed prices in competitor countries. We screw ourselves for minimal benefit to the overall environment. Okay, so you want to avoid doing that. How do you start thinking about ways of doing that? Well, right now we have a minor price cap. At that price cap, they release more units from the CCR. It doesn't really do much, it just releases a few more units that were already within the carbon budget, so it's fine. Now, get rid of the cost containment reserve. We've legislated the number of credits. Next, take a look around the world to see which carbon markets are actually credible in a very particular sense, and have the Climate Commission do this. If I went to Europe right now, I could set up a company. Anybody can do this. That company can buy European carbon credits. I can do that. Any of you could do that. I can take those credits, I can put them in a vault, and I can never use them. If I do that, Europe will have 1 fewer ton of net emissions. Find the other systems that are similarly durable and good, right? If it's at least, if it's of that comparable basis, figure out which ones those are. Figure out the volume weighted average price across those carbon trading schemes. It's got to be dominated by European prices because volumes there are huge compared to anywhere else. Track that average price and make that price our new price cap. At the price cap, government has 2 choices. They can go and plant some trees on the Crown Estate. There's a whole pile of dockland where you can plant a whole pile more totara and wonderful, beautiful trees, generate carbon credits, sell those credits into the market. Every one of those is a backed unit. The number of unbacked units is capped. The number of backed units is not. You can plant native trees at much less than the global average price in those credible markets. The government makes money every time it sells units at the price cap. That makes it more fiscally durable because government doesn't, they're not hemorrhaging money by doing it. So that's good. If planting native trees is more expensive than buying credits in the cheapest market that helps to define the price cap, well, buy credits in the cheapest market that helps to define the price cap, and we've already decided that those are the credible ones. Do not allow in hot air credits. These have to be real. And if we don't think Europe is real, then like the whole game's up, right? Like it's done. There's no hope. Europe has to be good enough. Get the set of markets that are good enough that way. buy a credit in that market, put it through a shredder, issue one more NZU saying this one is backed by this European unit that we have put through the shredder. And it doesn't matter how many of those units you release because they are all backed. They don't matter. The unbacked units that we care about, these ones are backed. That maintains the price cap so that New Zealand prices are not going above international average prices. So we don't get into terrible trade effects. That's a little bit complicated. Does it make sense?
Yeah, but I don't think it addresses the point that was made here.
Okay.
Just that if you've got production in countries that we're competing with,
Yep.
that don't have any, that are not a credible system, you still get carbon leakage to those countries.
Yeah. Part one, international negotiations around carbon equivalent tariffs at borders. Hopefully we wind up with something like that. And hopefully it won't take forever to get there. We do have industrial allocations. They might need to be adjusted a bit, but we would want to maintain those in the absence of having carbon equivalent tariffs at borders. And remember still, forests are cheap, man. We're going to keep planting trees. And eventually those opportunities run out. That's fine. We keep discovering new ones. All right, the other problem that we face is that when carbon prices go up, people might freak out. I'll do the carbon dividend last. Okay, the price cap, revised price cap will reduce the risk of carbon leakage because you don't risk going above the price in Europe, right? We still would have to maintain some industrial allocations, but it's not as bad a problem as you would have if you had a really actually tight cap and we started pushing past it and prices went above prices in Europe. We'd be in big trouble. This would avoid that. We probably want to be looking at industrial allocations so that they track downwards as international measures of carbon intensity reduce in different industrial sectors. So the point of the industrial allocations isn't to make people happy or to subsidize them or make sure that this business is in good shape. It's a carbon thing. It wants to avoid that there's a ton of emissions happening somewhere else instead of here, or worse, 2 tons somewhere else instead of here. If other places are actually more carbon efficient than us, leakage is good. If we shut down an inefficient plant here and there's more production somewhere else that has less carbon in it, that's a win. So industrial allocations should track down as emissions intensity continues to track down with tech overseas. So you want to probably rejig that a bit, but doing so also gives you more room then to have units that are auctioned rather than allocated, because we've got a fixed number of units, and the more of them that are given out in industrial allocations, the fewer of them that you can auction. Right now, the auction revenues are going into general revenues, except there aren't any. And that's a problem, right? So before they went into industrial subsidies, which were kind of dubious, and I've had some fights with ECA about that, but that's all good. Now they're going into the budget, and that is giving the government a problem because they were banking on money that's not there, and now they got a hole. That sucks for them. I have preferred an alternative, and this has been bog standard in environmental economics since the 1990s. Set a carbon tax, take the money, put it in a pot, split the pot among everybody in the population, call it a carbon dividend. That transfer is highly progressive. Rich people spend more money on everything. Carbon is in everything. Poor people spend less money on things because they have less money. If you take an equal ways split of a pot into which rich people have put more money, that transfer is highly progressive. Canada's carbon dividend resulted in 80 to 90% of households getting more back in a carbon dividend than they paid in carbon taxes. If you run that here, another one of the reasons that you might expect the ETS to be non-durable starts going away, because at least over this transition period, eventually we've got an ETS, we don't have a carbon tax, ETS revenues go to zero. Very clearly say this is a transitional payment to help you adapt to a higher carbon cost world. Get a heat pump, whatever the heck makes sense for you. We don't know, you know better than we do, whether insulation or an EV or what makes most sense. take your carbon dividend, start putting it, save towards the investments that you need to make for a lower carbon cost lifestyle, or lower carbon lifestyle with higher carbon costs. It helps to avoid that transitional problem, and at least over the medium term gives you some political cover for the minister, who can say, okay, yeah, everybody's mad about fuel prices, but that's why we gave you a carbon dividend at the start of the year. Why are you guys complaining? Like, most people got more money than they're paying out. Done, right? And people still get mad, but a problem that Canada had in setting its carbon dividend, they did it in the stupidest way possible. The best way of doing this is, I don't know if you guys remember Ed McMahon. Did he ever make it to New Zealand? Okay, he had these giant novelty checks that he'd give to the winners of the Publishers Clearinghouse like scam, where you go to the giant checks, $50,000, great big printed thing. A government official shows up at every house with a giant novelty check. And it says on it, this is your carbon dividend. You are getting this check right now because carbon prices are high. You would not be getting this check if carbon prices were not high. Use it carefully because the checks will stop coming. This is your carbon dividend, and it's mostly paid for by rich people. Ha! Okay. That would help make it more salient. And so what did Canada do? They got like one line on your automatic refund from their equivalent of IRD, and it's like inexplicable acronyms, and the money just shows up in your bank account, and you have no clue why it's right there.
It's a marketing fail.
But that is a huge marketing fail. There were some good comms by their environment minister around it occasionally, but nobody knew that they were getting this money. So that's not a good way of using a carbon dividend. It does actually address some of the equity issue, but people don't know it, so it doesn't ease the political pressure. You want the giant novelty checks, except New Zealand doesn't take checks anymore. So you want something equivalent. The other nice thing that you can do with the carbon dividend, I'd mentioned at the price cap, the government is making money. Take the money that the government makes and throw it into the carbon dividend pot. It boosts the carbon dividend whenever they're using it at the price cap. So once you bulletproof the ETS, the good argument against me, I think, largely goes away. If you have a better argument against me, I really want to hear it, because I want to make this thing bulletproof. And if there's a hole that I've not seen, that's something that needs to get fixed. Like, it's not going to offend me. It's like, well, I'm desperate to find reasons that this won't work so that I can try to make it better, because this matters. If we do it this way, you really have to make sure the accounting is right. You have to keep watching for these other areas where regulation is going to be needed as people change behavior drastically, as carbon prices change. But you're not going to have to do all the rest of this other stuff, which is incredibly costly, not just on the private sector, but like on officials trying to put together. I don't know if you guys have looked through the stuff that the Climate Change Commission does, putting out these giant budgets for, can you imagine like spending your life trying to do that? And a lot of people, like really smart, capable people, have had to put so many hours into that kind of work. But that work is fundamentally useless if you've got this. You don't, like, you might want to get some rough and ready guesses about where transition paths are going to go so that you can anticipate areas for regulation. But you don't need any of that. It sorts itself out in the same way that you don't need to have great big plans that are saying where every bag of flour is going to wind up in the country. Like, that'd be dumb, right? It sorts itself out. Nobody has to plan that. We all make our own little plans, and those plans coordinate through the price system, and it sorts. You don't need a flour commission that sorts it out. We don't need a climate commission sorting this out if the ETS has been made bulletproof. And you can drive it to net zero a lot more effectively, more durably, more credibly, and you can even think about driving it down faster, because you know that you're going to be taking a lowest cost approach to doing it. Yes.
Eric, your thesis is there is a good challenge to the ETS as currently designed, and you proposed a set of reforms to bulletproof and to fix that and to give it a robust cap. My question is, at what year between now and 2050, and Parliament hasn't taken the steps to bulletproof the regime and to make the cap real, do you then acknowledge the failure of the ETS and you need to move to ancillary regulatory or other responses? And we're at 2040.
Yeah.
And your fix hasn't been instigated. What then?
Okay, right now I'm not worried because they're not even selling units, right? All of the units that are being used are old stockpiled ones and ones that are being generated by sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. So there's a minor concern when Labor's response to the Climate Commission's proposals looked like they were scared about ETS prices going up. That was worrying. You don't want to have that. Nevertheless, we've gotten into a spot where you're getting faster emissions reductions effectively because nobody's using these those auction units aren't going through. So that's good. I would start worrying about it if it became obvious that the government were regularly responding to high carbon prices by changing the pathway. Then it's obvious, okay, yeah, it's bust and we can't rely on it anymore. I don't think we're at that point yet. I think we've got plenty of time to still bulletproof this thing. I think it'd be better to do it sooner rather than later because otherwise you're not going to be able to actually do the carbon dividend because eventually I think in the 2030s, it's mainly going to be industrial allocations under the current setup. You probably want to adjust that. Eventually the thing runs out. You would like to have those transfers going through in time for people to use them to help facilitate a path to a higher carbon price world.
One of the problems with your carbon dividend is you're going to face the perennial argument that there is a segment of population who need assistance on how to spend their money wisely, right? So you end up paying a carbon dividend to a segment of population, just like, we have this argument, I don't support it.
Yeah, I'm listening.
So you have this segment who get the money as carbon dividend, but they squander it, as we might think about it. So they need to be looked after when the money runs out, when the we're still not net zero, but that they haven't put that money towards decarbonizing or doing the changes that they need to do.
Okay. Well, one, that problem isn't just with a carbon dividend, that's kind of across any kinds of benefits.
Social.
Two, I'm not sure, okay, to the extent that you would worry about it, there are information things that you could be doing, like with those giant novelty checks saying, hey, you know what? Your power bill is likely going to go up by this much. Maybe you want to be doing stuff that will bring down your power bill. You could be doing things like, one bit that I'm surprised hasn't been done and seems like an obvious one, we've got all those fuel economy stickers on the cars. It would be real easy to add another column on there saying, and you know what, your running costs on this are going to be this much when the carbon price hits at $100. Like that'd be simple, right? It helps me make better decisions. That kind of informational thing I'm not averse to. I also expect that, okay, I worry a little bit less about it because I am a bit of a tech optimist and I think that the costs of mitigation will come down, but I could easily be wrong about that. That's a me bet on it. The system is robust either way, right? It targets dead emissions. It doesn't matter whether sequestration works out really well or not, or we still get to net zero. It just changes the price. Yeah. I don't think that you wind up in any worse spots than we're already in with families that are in hardship and have made bad financial choices. I don't think that the relatively small numbers of cases like that would be driving sufficient political pressure to break the system.
But you don't get to a net zero position but you get to a position where the rich people or rich breaks aren't funding the carbon anymore. So you have this segment using carbon, but no one's subsidizing it anymore.
Yeah, carbon's in everything. Rich people will have a smaller proportion of their everything that is carbon, but they're still spending way more than on everything, right? Get international air travel into the ETS. That'd help.
So just on that note,
Yeah.
when this dividend's been implemented in Canada and Switzerland, and
Yep.
what's the research on how that changes public opinion of a carbon tax or what the impact is for the general populace? Like, is it a proven positive, or do you think it's fallen down because of this issue of communications and marketing? And
The Canadian one has obviously fallen over now, and I think it was the communications issue. So there, in the election, okay, the carbon dividend was robust for a good period, despite terrible comms. When we were doing the petrol excise rebate, you had Stéphane Guilbeault, who went up and said, you know, we've given you a carbon dividend. We don't, and this has nothing to do with the carbon tax. This has everything to do with the war in Ukraine. We're not going to be doing a petrol excise holiday. That was all good. We didn't respond that way. It eventually broke down in the some by-elections in Atlantic Canada when Trudeau started promising to have carbon tax or differential carbon tax charges on home heating oil, where home heating oil is only used in Atlantic Canada and not in other parts of the country. So it is clearly a subsidy to Atlantic provinces, and that pissed off everybody else, and things started to unravel. So I think that's still a carbon dividend helps towards bulletproofing. It addresses real equity considerations. If you get the comms on it wrong and people don't know that they're getting that transfer for that reason, you're going to wind up in problems. That's why I like the giant novelty checks.
so just an interesting proposition. We're in a space where comms has been slashed and it's seen as not important, but here, and you're saying this is one of the most important things for something like this to work. And I just wonder if it would take probably some research to show that it's proven to work in order to convince government to undertake something like that in terms of the comms side of it.
Can I ask a slightly more generic question? What do you think it would take to get the kind of changes you're proposing to actually be implemented?
The government has said that they want to have an ETS-led approach. They will come under pressure for some of the potential failings in the ETS. They will not want, they have clearly signaled that they don't want to be pursuing 10,000 regulations as a way of dealing with this. The incongruence can lead to pressure to bulletproof the thing. They will not want to give up ETS revenue, except to the extent that right now it's pretty easy because there isn't any. It would have been best to have done it 2 years ago when carbon prices were really high, and if carbon prices go to zero and carbon dividend goes to zero, it's fine because it's not carbon-induced cost of living pressure. That's what a low carbon price is telling you. So the dividend flexes with the amount of pressure that's being put on because of carbon prices. So that's the advantage of it over the medium term anyways, while we're still getting revenues from it. Another pressure point that could get towards this is as we get closer to 2030, and if they don't actually have anything in the bag for dealing with 2030, legislating a smaller number of units that can be issued between now and 2050 than would have otherwise been expected could be a way of getting around that.